Hello and welcome. My name is Alan Cohen. I'm an experienced software and systems engineer and manager who specializes in the development of medical devices and other high reliability systems. I often consult to companies that are venturing into the world of medical devices, and they're looking to understand what they're getting into from a regulatory perspective. For most medical devices, the biggest regulatory effort is in meeting various recognized standards that are required for gaining clearance from the FDA and from other similar agencies around the world. To help folks to better understand the breadth of standards that they'll typically encounter in this process, I'm producing a series of short videos to outline the core medical device standards that are addressed by almost every medical device that contains electronics and software. In this first video, I'll briefly review the background and ground rules that practitioners should know in order to use these standards effectively. For many of us, when we think of medical devices, we think of regulations and standards. And there's no doubt that there are a lot of regulations and standards around medical devices. And most would agree that regulations and standards are pretty important in ensuring that devices are safe and effective. At the beginning of any medical device development effort, it's important to make sure that we map out the path to meeting all necessary regulations and standards. First off, we should determine which regulations and standards apply. We can think of these as requirements, just like the product's size, power source, reliability, and so forth. Identifying applicable regulations and standards is really just a specialized part of the requirements capture process. We should also have a strategy for meeting these regulations and standards as easily as possible, with a minimum of expense, paperwork, and overhead time. This particularly applies to processes. Few things kill morale as efficiently as a cumbersome process that people don't believe is helping them to build a better product. And it turns out that, in most cases, lightweight processes often helped by standard, inexpensive, or free software can be used to accomplish most or all of what we need to do here. Many companies, particularly inexperienced ones, start thinking comprehensively about regulations and standards late in the game. This is a bad idea. It's important to think about these things in a thorough, comprehensive way up front for a couple of reasons. First off, if we find out about a regulation or standard late in the game, we may have to go back and perform redesign that costs money and delays product launch, or even leads to a recall. If you think about it, failure to meet a regulation is really a bug, since it prevents the product from meeting its intended use. On the right, we see a relatively well-known graph showing the relationship between the time in the product lifecycle at which a bug is discovered versus the cost of remediating the bug. As any experienced engineer knows, the cost of fixing a bug can rise exponentially as time passes before it's discovered. To pick a dramatic example, something that might have been an extra few hours of design time early in the development process can turn into an expensive recall if discovered after units are in customers' hands. Second, if we're not smart about a regulation or standard, then we may not fully meet it and find ourselves with bad news during an FDA submission or audit. Or conversely, we could spend far more time and money meeting the standard than we need to. In this presentation, we'll outline the core group of standards that need to be met by medical devices, which include embedded hardware and software. The purpose here is to gain a high-level understanding of what each of these standards is about. Some of these standards are quite large, some even hundreds of pages long, so we'll just touch a little on each one and give a short summary. Note that we'll be covering standards rather than regulations. For most medical devices, most regulations actually involve meeting internationally accepted standards. Those standards are what we'll be focusing on. We won't, for example, review the process of determining whether a device is actually a medical device and thus subject to regulation by the FDA and similar international bodies. Nor will we be reviewing the process for submitting an application to the FDA. A few caveats about this video series before we get going. First off, most of these standards only apply to medical devices, particularly to medical devices with embedded hardware and software. If your device is not a medical device, then different standards will apply. However, we will review certain non-medical specific standards that medical devices normally do need to meet, such as those from the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. Second, these are the core standards, but some devices need to meet other standards that are more specific to what they do. And finally, the material presented here is only my opinion, and only in a general sense. While these videos should be a good basis for understanding the standards framework, you should make sure to get expert advice that addresses your specific situation. Before we dig into the standards themselves, let's get a little context by reviewing the ground rules of selecting and using standards. We generally adhere to standards because we have to in order to comply with government regulations. In the U.S., the Food and Drug Administration creates the regulations that apply to medical devices. For most device developers, the FDA documents that are of the greatest importance to them are the FDA guidances. These tend to communicate goals, give examples, and make suggestions about how to meet those goals, but they generally don't mandate the specifics of how the goals are met. Rather, they call on the manufacturer to determine what FDA calls the least burdensome approach to meeting these higher-level goals. The EU clears medical products for sale through the CE marking system, which certifies conformance to the EU Medical Devices Directive. Compared to the US process, obtaining a CE mark tends to be a more tightly specified process for the types of devices that we're focusing on in this presentation. There are a fair number of applicable standards, and these tend to be more specific than their corresponding FDA guidances. The CE mark is awarded by organizations known as notified bodies, which are accredited by governments. There are dozens of notified bodies, both publicly and privately run, and they all charge fees for their services. In general, a device maker should select the notified body they'll be working with early in the development process, come to an agreement around which standards must be met, and continue to work with them through the development process to ensure that they're on the right track for gaining approval once they're ready to go to market. Other parts of the world have other requirements. It's best to get advice on how to address these from a local notified body. And finally, customers may be looking for specific standards, even if the government does not require them. It's best to talk with prospective customers and to review the standards that are met by similar devices which are already sold in markets of interest. The good news is that governments and standards bodies around the world have worked together to make their standards more compatible with one another. This process is known as harmonization. Currently, the strategy employed by most device makers is to comply with the EU CE mark standards, which will typically essentially fulfill FDA's requirements. The EU CE mark standards will also get you pretty close to where you need to be in other markets as well. So in this presentation, we'll be focusing on standards that are needed in the EU. This will get most devices most of the way to where they need to be. So who develops these standards? In the US, the FDA develops guidances as we've discussed, and these are publicly available on the FDA's site. In the EU and much of the rest of the world, governments look to standards produced by independent organizations. These organizations create standards for all kinds of things. A small group of them creates the standards designed specifically for medical devices. These organizations are typically known by their acronyms, such as ISO, IEC, AAMI, ANSI, UL, BSI, DIN, and some others. Some groups, such as ISO and IEC, tend to create international standards. Others tend to create country-specific editions of standards. For example, UL 60601-1 is simply IEC 60601-1 with national deviations. As we'll see later, IEC 60601-1 is the fundamental international medical device safety standard. The UL version simply makes small changes to the IEC version in order to address the specifics of the US market. Also note that unlike the FDA guidances, standards from independent bodies such as ISO, IEC, and the others are not freely available. They must be purchased. If you don't already own the standards that you need, acquiring a set can cost $1,000 or more. Another important note is that you should always pay attention to the addition of a standard. Standards can be revised every few years, and once a revised standard is published, it can take years for different regulatory agencies to recognize the update. In some unhappy cases, different governments have recognized different editions of a standard for periods of time. Usually everyone catches up to the latest standard at some point, but be aware that the latest version may not be the one that you need to follow. Does thinking of standards make you feel like this? Well, definitely don't panic. It really doesn't have to be so bad. Most standards look scary at first glance, but they really just call out best practices. They help you to make a better product. The people I know who've sat on standards committees are good engineers with years of real-world engineering experience. They are very thoughtful about creating guidelines that help to ensure good outcomes without adding undue burden. Most standards are pretty easy to deal with if they are considered early in the development process. Wait until the end, however, and all bets are off. If you're not experienced in this world, your best bet is probably to work with someone who is experienced to shepherd you through this process. That will save you from reading and interpreting several hundred pages of material and help you to implement the easiest, lightest weight processes for developing, manufacturing, selling, and shipping your product. That concludes the first chapter in our overview of core medical device standards. I hope that it was helpful and that it sets the foundation for future videos that will review the standards themselves. If you have any questions or comments, please contact me at medtechnerd@gmail.com or visit my blog at www.medtechnerd.com.